So what I'd like to do now is move and talk about what is the nature and extent of juvenile offending in Australia. So how much juvenile crime is there? And what types of crimes do juveniles commit? Well, firstly, it's widely accepted that young people commit a disproportionate amount of crime. So people aged between 15 and 19 are processed by the police for the commission of crime more so than any other age group in the population. You can see here these data were taken from 2007-2008 for our Facts and Figures publication, which many of you will have looked at. And it shows here that the rate of offending for persons aged 15 to 19 is 4 times the rate of offending for those aged over 19. And this is really consistent. So offender rates have been consistently highest among 15 to 19-year-olds and lowest among those aged 25 and over. But it's important to recognise that most people simply grow out of offending. They grow up, they mature, they get married, they have children, they get a mortgage, become very boring like me, and they stop committing crimes. But what is important to recognise within that is that people do so at different rates. And without going into that in too much detail, you don't need to worry about what this says, you just need to get the overall shape. So we call this an age crime curve, and you will have seen these in the literature, and if you haven't, you'll no doubt come across them. It essentially shows that offending peaks basically in late adolescence, and then it peters off once people are into their early 20s. So this age crime curve, the concept of the age crime curve, has been critiqued at length, and there's been a lot of debate about it, but it is nonetheless one of the most generally accepted tenets in criminology. As I said before, despite this, people actually grow out of crime at different rates. So there are several different trajectories, if you like, for offending. And I guess the key thing to grasp there is that there's a small, what we call a core, there's a small core of juvenile offenders who commit an enormous amount of crime. So it's not that each young person's committing 1 or 2, it's that there are a small number who are committing multiple crimes, and it's often those young people who then don't grow out of crime and persist in offending throughout their lives. So that sounds like a bit of a gloomy picture, but despite this very strong relationship between age and crime, of course the vast majority of young people never come into contact with the criminal justice system. There was a study conducted just recently, which is up on our website actually, by Troy Allard and some of his colleagues up at Griffith University. And the study was a cohort study, so they essentially looked at everyone born in Queensland in 1983. And they looked at everyone over a period of a number of years to see how many had come into contact with the criminal justice system by the time they had turned 17. So that meant if they'd had a caution, if they'd had a conference, or if they'd been to court. And they found that 14% of all people born in Queensland in 1983 had one or more formal contact with the criminal justice system. So most people simply never come into contact with the police. In terms of the types of offences that young people commit, there are certain offences that they commit disproportionately. So things like graffiti and vandalism, shoplifting, and fare evasion is another one. So fare evasion, you'll see in a lot of police statistics, it essentially just means getting on a train without a ticket, getting caught, but who among us hasn't been there? On the other hand, young people very rarely commit, very violent offences like homicide and sexual assault. And also things like white-collar crime and fraud, of course, because young people are simply not in the right circumstances, I suppose, to commit those types of offences. In comparison with adults, juveniles tend to commit offences in groups. They tend to commit offences close to home. So young people simply aren't as mobile as older people. They don't always have cars, they don't have money to catch trains, so they do tend to do things in their own backyard. They're also very public when they offend. So young people tend to commit offences, at places like shopping centres and on trains and on public transport. And they tend to do things on the spur of the moment, so they're quite opportunistic, and they do things that are very attention-seeking. So young people are actually pretty visible. They're more visible than adults, and they tend to come to the attention of police much more readily than adults. So you can see here, this is a slide. This was taken from a recent research project, which I think is available still over here, which was called Juveniles Contact with the Criminal Justice System in Australia. And it was essentially just looking at published state and territory police data on juveniles' contact with the police. So I understand you can't see those figures up the back and you don't need to. The important thing is that this simply shows in each jurisdiction the proportion of all police contacts with people that were for juveniles. Now that varies across jurisdictions, probably primarily because jurisdictions count things in different ways. So in Western Australia they count arrests, in New South Wales they count persons of interest. Okay, so that gives us a totally different count, which is the bane of my life sometimes. But the important thing is, generally speaking, we can say that about a fifth to a quarter of all police contacts are with juveniles. Now that might sound totally contradictory to what I just said about offending peaking among young people, and that's primarily because we define young people more broadly. So we define young people usually as going up to 20, say, whereas this is strictly 10 to 17-year-olds. So a lot of offending actually peaks at around the 18 and 19 years. So if we were including those young people, that proportion would be much bigger. Great, so another really important thing to recognise when we're talking about juveniles coming into contact with the criminal justice system is that they're not only disproportionately the perpetrators of crime, they're actually disproportionately the victims of crime as well. And that's something that we very rarely hear, I think, in the media and in community debate about these issues. So young people aged 15 to 24, for example, are at a higher risk of assault than any other age group in Australia. Young males aged 15 to 19 are more than twice as likely to become a victim of robbery as those aged 25 or older. When we look at sexual offending, it's incredibly disturbing actually. Our most recent data on sexual offending come from 2007, where we found that the highest rate of recorded sexual assault in Australia was against 10 to 14-year-old females. The other aspect around victimisation that's really important to grasp is that juveniles often perpetrate crimes against other juveniles. So Jason Payne, who you'll meet in a moment, and myself and some other colleagues have been working, and Adam, sorry, have been working on a project looking at child homicide victimisation in Australia. And we found there that when we looked at the older juveniles, so sort of the 15 to 17 age range, that about a quarter of those victims had been killed by other juveniles. So this boundary between juvenile offenders and juvenile victims is actually sort of quite porous, and we believe that those groups overlap substantially, and that's a really important issue for us in terms of future research.